Okay, this is good. A lot of people came back after lunch. Did you get enough to eat out there in the art exhibits? And I saw some people sitting on rocks like limpets, So that was pretty cool. I'm not sure what I'm going to do right now. I was up until 3 o'clock thinking about it, but there's a lot of good news coming out of Nevada. And I thought I'd kind of do a lot of that, and we'll see what happens next. But you notice the title here, Nature Wants to Be Wet, Rehydrating the Continents. In Nevada right now, Carol Evans is talking about, just like this, Nevada wants to be wet, rehydrating, the state of Nevada. What is that all about? So let's, what I might do is start with a different story. This is a rainfall map of the United States. What's the right answer? Where will this restoration ecology not work? Okay, you can see that, right? And I was told you have to say it in Nevada because that's what they say in Nevada. And what about a place like right here? Is that pretty close to where you think it won't work? And so there was an experiment done on gold mining waste in 1989 that I think was probably the most important experiment of the 20th century. And this is gold mining waste, and they ran cyanide through this to see what would happen if they could get the last bit of gold out. And then they were supposed to revegetate it. And there was nothing alive in the soil. Can you believe that? So after about 2 or 3 tries, the mining company hired these crazy cattle people. They brought in all the cows they could find. They brought in 30 tons of hay within all their trucks. And they had these 600 cows. This woman, Jerry Tipton, took maybe 100 bales up that hill that day. That was a tough one. And she and her husband became some of the best restoration ecologists I ever heard of. And these cows were there for 4 days. And this is what it looked like 6 months later. This had the highest biomass in that area of Nevada in years and years and years and years. About 1,200 pounds of dry matter per acre, something like that. And then for about 2 years, it was fine. And then eventually it got to the point where it needed another grazing spell. But this is what got me about this was, if you can do it in Nevada, you could do it anywhere. But the problem was getting water to animals that far out there, when you're starting from scratch like that. And I always wondered about that. So then something happened last year. When I saw it, I just cried because it was so interesting. And let's see if I can find it. We'll go here. And this is up near Elko, Nevada. This is Susie Creek. And this is you notice how steep these palisades are here. Those are probably 15 or 20 feet on average. And this creek, normally in the spring, would just, the snow would melt off the tops here of these mountains and just rush rush downstream and carry everything with it and just grind out these chasms. And so this is Carol Evans, a biologist out there. She's been watching these creeks for 25, 30 years. And she came out one day and saw that hadn't happened, that there was vegetation down there in the spring. And what was going on? Anybody got any ideas? Well, she was a fish person, so we'll get back to that. But this is what showed up. We thought beaver needed wood. And it turned out they didn't. And they didn't even know where they came from. So that was And beaver, they can eat vegetation, but what would happen if a beaver came in and started blocking up the streams and held that water on the land, like their ancestors did? What would happen after that? What would happen next? Stuff would start growing again, and the wood would come back. So I had this picture. Everybody knows that beaver make their dams, and then they build a lodge, and then they find a way to get underneath it because they can't see very well, and they need to spend their time underwater as much as possible. They like to chop the trees down so they land in the water if they can, and then they take the smaller branches and they block everything up, and then they live in here, through the winter and stuff. And so here's Susie Creek. You see how dry it is out in the uplands. Nevada was going through the biggest drought that they'd had in a long time, so is California. This is an area that gets, on average, about 10 inches of rain, and they hadn't gotten anywhere near that. And all of a sudden, this starts to rehydrate. And And the other thing that was coming back was these. Carol's a fish biologist in Nevada. That's a hard job. This was in 2003. These were the areas where the Lahontan trout was still found, at least a few of them. Well, the Great Basin is, it doesn't flow to the ocean, but they had trout. They're pretty robust trout, and they're thinking, well, maybe they can expand if these beaver are impacted. Now, it was interesting when this picture, the ranchers out there, John Griggs is saying, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen here. What do we do about this? They're going to take over, because ranchers kind of want to make their own decisions. And they didn't know what he'd do. Would he mess everything up? And Carol, being the observer, just said, why don't we wait and see what happens? And it became not about carbon sequestration or any of that stuff. It became about water. That if you have water, you're going to put a lot of carbon in the ground. At least that's what I believe. So they actually came to our conference last October. And Carol, I called her up and said, would you like to come to Boston and tell us what's going on? And he says, I'm not coming without, one or two of the ranchers, because they're part of this story. The beaver could not live out there unless they got their grazing right. They spent 20 years trying to figure out how to slow that water down, and they were getting fairly good at it, and all of a sudden the beaver showed up without even any invitation. So then things started getting interesting. And so John Griggs came. He's the Maggie Creek Ranch. He's the foreman, I guess you'd call him. And so I have this kind of saying, if you can rehydrate Nevada, you can do it anywhere. So now think about this on a continental level. Think about the American West. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Texas. Texas is dry in a bone. This place is 10-inch rainfall a year. Texas gets twice that, most places that are dry as a bone. California gets a lot more than that. If California was 10% wetlands like it used to be in the Central Valley, in the mountains, they wouldn't have a problem. I totally believe that, and inevitably that's going to happen. It's either post-civilization or, we actually become part of the symbiotic team. Humans become part of the symbiosis team and make this happen. And so here's evidence. Andrea, you're in these pictures. And so this is Carol coming to Boston. This is at the top of Tufts, and you can see the buildings down there. And this is John Griggs without his hat. It was hard to find him in a picture without his hat. Walking around Boston, he had so much fun. He just thought, everybody in the world lives here. And we go up on top of Tufts, and we're looking at the airport. We're watching the planes come in from Tufts. And he says, wait a minute, that's where I landed. It took me 3 hours to fly there from Minneapolis. And it took me 3 hours to get from there to the campus. That's relativity. So here's what happened last winter. They got more snow last winter. And they were wondering, is it because these valleys are starting to hydrate more? Nevada is a bunch of mountain ranges. One right after the other. They're all lined north-south. And so these creeks run in between them. And because they had more moisture in these bottoms, they were wondering, is that water going to get up over the mountains? And they caught a lot more snow this year. and they were wondering what's going to happen in the spring. So this happened, I think this was February. And you notice it's not rushing off. You know, it's not scouring out the bottoms like it would almost every other year. And here's another picture, and some of it's still ice here. But they were still kind of nervous because, well, what happens when that ice breaks up? And so I have a picture here from an airplane. You can see the Ruby Mountains here. Isn't that amazing? They're like, I don't think they're almost 12,000 feet high. And you see what happens, these scoured banks here. And this area is starting to fill up. And then when you get a better picture, notice how many stop, you know, there's a little check there, it's being checked, it's being checked, it's being checked, it's being checked. And I'm asking Carol, I say, well, are the beaver there? And she says, well, in a lot of these places the beaver have moved on because there's so much sediment. And I said, you know, there's so much stuff building up in there. The water table is probably 2 feet higher than it was. And the sediment's there's probably 2 feet of sediment that they didn't have 10 years ago. How much carbon is that? If anybody wants to actually study something, they'd be curious if they want to come out and tell them, you know. But I think it's easily 100 tons per acre. And this particular stream had 70 acres. You know, it might be 150, but I'll stand on 100 and you can correct me. But just notice how much they've stopped this, and this water's kind of going over these things. But then it was too muddy for the beaver to play with, so they went upstream. They're starting to go try to figure out how to rehydrate higher up the mountain. At least that's what we think's happening. And like this valley here, all this stuff coming in, getting more and more elaborate. You know, this is the beginning of the new West to me. And like I said, when I first saw this, I thought, oh my gosh, we totally missed beaver. The beaver were eradicated from the American West before the biologists ever got out there. You know, that's the American story. You know, it was just a. So, how many were there? Were there 100 million on the North American continent? Probably. Probably. We'll never know. But how many do we want now? You know, we were down to about 5 million. There's probably about double that now. There might be 10 million on the continent. But if you're trying to rehydrate the West, well, let's go back to that map. In Texas, we always talked about the 100th meridian, which cut off the panhandle here. And that's where the rain it went less than 20 inches of rain. This area, a lot of it, there's 100 counties or more that are being depopulated because there's just not enough moisture in the soil. They get enough rain, they get a lot more rain than Nevada does, but they don't know how to keep it in the ground. And if you do good grazing, it's possible to do it, but what if you learned how to do this with a whole ecosystem approach, you know? And I missed the beaver altogether, you know, that was my... So here's down on the ground. This is an area the beaver aren't in anymore, but look what's happening here. And all these willows are coming up, and they're sending moisture up into the air. That's transpiration. That's moisture going up, and it gets up and high in the sky. And what does it do high in the sky? Well, if it gets high enough, and these mountains are high enough, it becomes snow, or it might become rain. But what it does is it gives off an awful lot of energy. And that's your cooling. That's your cooling effect. That's how the earth cools itself. And the idea is, how do we make the cycle on the land run these water molecules round and round and round and round, rather than just run off the ground as fast as possible? What the ranchers were doing a lot of times, they thought, if this gets blocked up like this and you got willows, we're losing water out of the ground, and we'll have to break all these up. And then we'll have a flood and all the water disappears. And you know, our understanding of how these systems work is just not very good. But now Carol's looking at that. They call them phreophytes. But, you know, it's the idea, if you put the moisture up, eventually you can use it over again. And here's another example of that. This is about 6 weeks ago. And so let's go to California. This is the area. There were biologists in 1937 that said the beavers were invasive species to California. And yet in the, I don't know, the 1500s, the Russians were trading with the Indians along the coast for otters and beavers and whatever. And then they started looking and they started finding out all these reports. The Hudson Bay the Hudson Bay Company hired people like Jebediah Smith to go out there and go up every one of these streams and get rid of all the beaver, because they thought if we could get rid of them in the 1820s, the Americans would never come because there wouldn't be any reason for them to come. They didn't think about the gold. Beaver was the big thing, and beaver disappeared all over the continent, and that's when North America started to dehydrate. The buffalo, it didn't help when the buffalo disappeared. It didn't help when we put cattle inside fences and didn't let them move. But we started to dehydrate. So now, this is comes from Michael Crosschecks' work, the water paradigm. I've learned so much from that. He was at our conference last year. That's stuff you can watch on our internet. But I was going to ask you this. Where do you think this is? This was an area that was very dry in the 1980s, and they had to be irrigated to grow grain. Where is that? Colorado. Yeah, look, you got wolves, you got otters, you've got, and you got beaver activity. These are, what are these horses? What are these called? These are the horses from Poland that I can't pronounce. What is this right here? What is that great big thing? Is that a spaceship? That's Chernobyl. This was an area that looked a lot like Iowa or Nebraska. It was a grains, it was irrigation ditches, miles and miles and miles and miles. And then Chernobyl happened, and everybody came back. And yeah, it's tough, and you have some people dying from cancer and whatever, but wolves don't expect to live to be 60, 70 years old. And they're doing pretty good. And the water came back, and then I started wondering, were there beaver, how much of Asia had beaver in it? And I went and found out. So all the way to Mongolia. Right now the Chinese are drying out because they're trying to do farming in Mongolia, which is grazing lands. And so I'm kind of wanting to challenge this group to think big. If we could rehydrate these continents, a lot of carbon would go down in the ground. It would be like it used to be. And there'd be a lot more future for everybody, really. So is it, the 3-minute guy is talking. Let's see, so I'll say, I learned a lot of this stuff from a little book that was written by a woman, Alice Outwater. Alice Outwater worked on the Boston Harbor. She was an engineer. She was a chemical engineer. And she realized that what she was doing as a chemical engineer wasn't cleaning the water. And she started studying how nature did it. And she's, started studying the history of the beaver and a lot of other things too. And so that's 2 of my favorite books. And they've actually got the water book back there.
We do have a few copies of CAS, but they're not at the book.
Yeah.
Come and see all of them.
And I think what I try to do with anybody that I'm involved with, but with my symbiosis team that spoke today, it says, this quote, this is Glynis Hood, who's a professional, she's a PhD biologist up in Alberta, and she said, there's something in that persistent drive to sustain water on the landscape that is the clue for our own survival as a species. Whether we take the time to learn from other species depends on our own adaptability and willingness to see our world and the resources within it in a new light. So that's the challenge. Can humans become part of the symbiosis team? And that's my story. I'm sticking to it. So.